So hello everyone, and I hope everyone is doing well. So what I want to do is I want to use the textbook a little bit because there's a lot of more details in the textbook than were in the slides. So two gentlemen here, Graham and Harvey, found that a minority of firms in their study do not use the NPV rule at all. So the question really, and this is a good thing in your book, why do other rules exist other than the NPV? So furthermore, it appears that most firms use both the NPV and the IRR. Why do firms use rules that other than the NPV if they can lead to problems, right? So one possible explanation, they say, is that Graham and Harvey's survey results might be misleading. Managers may use the payback rule for budgeting purposes or as a shortcut to get a quick sense of the project before calculating net present value. Similarly, chief financial officers who are using the IRR as a sensitivity measure in conjunction with the NPV might have checked both the IRR box and the NPV box on their survey. Nevertheless, a significant minority of managers surveyed replied that they use only the IRR rule. So managers may use the IRR rule exclusively because you do not need to know the opportunity cost of capital to calculate the IRR. But this benefit is superficial. While you may not need to know the cost of capital to calculate the IRR, you certainly need to know the cost of capital when you apply the rule, right? You have to make sure you're graded in it. So that's an interesting blurb here. They did a survey of all this. And so let me go forward here. Hopefully this thing works correctly. All right, so we talked about mutually exclusive projects, which were here, right? And you can clearly see that this one had the larger net present value. Okay. Mutually exclusive was if you could only pick one. So you would pick, in this case, the coffee shop. Okay, so there's a couple of things. This is kind of really what I wanted to talk about. Because the internal rate of return is a measure of the expected return of investing in a project, you might be tempted to extend the IRR investment rule to the case of mutually exclusive projects by picking the project with the highest IRR. And this is where, again, it falls apart. Unfortunately, picking one project over another simply because it has a larger IRR can lead to mistakes. In particular, when projects differ in their scale, and this is important, scale of investment, the timing of their cash flows or their riskiness. Three things: scale, investment, and timing, and the riskiness. Okay, then there could be a problem with the IRR. So let's look at difference in scale first. All right, so would you prefer a 5% return on a dollar or a 20% return on a million? So 500%, right? So it's early yet. It's only 5:30, by the way. While a 500% return certainly sounds impressive, at the end of the day, you will only make $5, right? The latter, which is 20% on a million, is going to get you 200,000. Okay, so this comparison, it basically shows you a shortcoming of IRR. Because it's a return, you cannot tell how much value, and this is the important word, will actually be created without knowing the scale of the investment. So going up to this point, now if the project has a positive net present value, then if we can double its size, its net present value will double. This is the important consideration. By the law of one price, of course, you have to have everything has to have the same price, right? So doubling the cash flows of an investment opportunity must make it worth twice as much. However, the internal rate of return does not have this property. It is unaffected by the scale of the investment opportunity because the internal rate of return measures the average return of the investment. Hence, we cannot use the internal rate of return to compare projects of different scales. So I want to see if I can I thought I had a highlighter here, but I guess I don't. They usually give you like a highlighter. Alrighty. So anyway, so just to illustrate that, here's the bookstore and the coffee shop again, right? We can compute the IRR of each. So here's the internal rate of return of the bookstore and the coffee shop. Both projects have internal rates of return that exceed the 8% cost of capital that we talked about, right? But although the coffee shop has a lower internal rate of return because it is on a larger scale of investment, $400,000, you see that, versus $300,000, it generates a higher net present value, $1.2 million versus $960,000, and thus it is more valuable. So you can see the conflicts that arise right away based on difference in scales. All right, so here's difference in timing. Again, now here's two projects, a short-term project, right? After 1 year, you get paid back, and this one you get paid back after 5 years. So if you look at the internal rate of return, that's a 50%, right? 50% on that. And this is 50%, but 5 years later, because both projects have an internal rate of return of 50%, but only one lasts for a year, the other lasts for 5. So if the cost of capital for both projects is 10%, the short-term project has a net present value of $36.36, whereas the long-term project has a net present value, when you go through the math, of $371.51 here. Okay? And here's how they get that. They take this number here and divide it by the 5 years, right? To get the net present value. All right, so notice that despite having the same internal rate of return, the long-term project is more than 10 times as valuable as the short-term project. So you can clearly see how, again, the conflicts come up. Even when projects have the same horizon, the pattern of cash flows over time will often differ. Consider again the coffee shop and the music store investment alternatives. Both of these investments have the same initial scale and the same time horizon, right? Forever. But the internal rate of return of the music store is 26%. But although the music store has a higher internal rate of return than the coffee shop, 26 versus 23, it has a lower net present value, $900,000 versus $1.2 million. The reason the coffee shop has a higher net present value despite having a lower internal rate of return is its higher growth rate. And that's what I called out, right? It's got a higher growth rate. So the coffee shop has lower initial cash flows, but higher long-term cash flows than the music store. So that plays into account there. Okay, and then differences in risk. Basically, we look at differences in risk. So if you rank projects by their internal rate of return, it ignores the differences in risk, okay? So here's the electronics store with a 28% internal rate of return. And this internal rate of return is higher than those of all the other investment opportunities, right? So you would say, okay, I'll do that. Yet the electronics store has the lowest net present value. So you can see the conflict there. In this case, the investment in the electronics store is riskier, as evidenced by its higher cost of capital, right? So as we saw, I think it was 11%, right? So despite having a higher internal rate of return, it's not sufficiently profitable to be as attractive as the safer alternatives. So if we look at the electronics store again, let me see if I can go back. You can see the cost of capital is 11% here, right? It's 11%. So it's got higher risk. So it tends to have a higher internal rate of return, but the net present value was higher. I guess I got click this again. Hold on. I don't know why it's jumping many pages for some reason. All right, so here's where we were. Whoops. So anyway, you can see that this has higher risk because of the 11% there. Alrighty, so let me see if this changes pages correctly. Okay, so now when you have projects of different length, we calculate the incremental internal rate of return. And when choosing between two projects, an alternative to comparing their internal rate of return is to compare basically the difference. It says incremental, so basically they're saying look at the difference in the internal rate of return. So we look at the incremental cash flows, okay? So, all right, I'm going to go through this again because I'm over 11 minutes now. I'll go on to the next